The first thing she remembered was the sound not of love, not of loss, but of wood striking wood in the dark, a single, hollow thud across the water that split one life from another. Years later, she heard it again, same rhythm, same cold wind, but this time, the echo came from the heart of a man who'd sworn never to touch anyone again. He'd built walls from silence, and she, without meaning to, brought light into the cracks. Some people meet through chance. Others meet through the same moment of pain, only years apart. And when they finally recognize it, that one small act that tied their fates together, forgiveness becomes the only language left. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. Wind drove sheets of rain across the harbor road, slapping against the windshield like handfuls of salt water. The old chapel sat at the end of the bluff, its steeple dark against the November sky, windows glazed with the dull gleam of sea spray. Inside, the smell of damp wood and extinguished candles clung to every pew. Ben Kincaid stood at the altar, collar rigid against his throat. The minister's voice echoed through the emptiness, formal and brief, while two witnesses, the lawyer and Ben's foreman, shifted on their feet. No music, no flowers, only the rattle of the wind through the cracked panes. Claire Hadley arrived 5 minutes late, coat drenched, hair pinned with practical precision. She paused at the door, eyes adjusting to the dimness, before walking the narrow aisle, as if she'd practiced not to tremble. Ben had seen her once before, across a boardroom table, calm, clear-spoken, unwilling to be impressed. Now, her poise had a steadiness that unsettled him more than beauty ever could. The minister cleared his throat. "We are gathered here under the sight of God and the citizens of Stonemere." A gust of wind drowned out the rest, howling through the rafters. The lawyer murmured something about a heating bill. Ben said nothing. This marriage wasn't about warmth. It was about paper, property, and the signature that would keep the Gray Gull lighthouse from falling into the hands of men who'd turn it into a luxury hotel. When the vows came, they spoke them like two people signing a contract. Benjamin Reeves Kincaid," he said, voice deep but flat, "take you, Claire Hadley, in lawful marriage." She repeated his name carefully, her voice lighter but firm, as if each word weighed something she could lift only once. The minister prompted the line everyone waited for. Ben met her gaze, gray eyes meeting hazel, and said quietly, almost apologetically, "I'll never touch you." A muscle tightened near her jaw. She nodded once. "I'm not here for that." Silence hummed between them, filled only by the restless sea beyond the walls. The lawyer scribbled a note, pretending not to notice the absence of tenderness. The rings were simple bands, ordered by the lawyer from a catalog. Ben's hand was warm but unyielding when she slipped the gold onto his finger. When it was her turn, he hesitated before taking her hand, long, fine-boned, with a faint ink stain near the thumb. He thought absurdly of tide marks on sand, where water had almost reached. The minister closed the book with a sigh of relief. "By the authority of the state of Maine, I now pronounce you husband and wife." A pause. "You may—" He didn't finish. Everyone knew what came next. Ben turned, the air thick with formality. He meant to bow his head, to offer a polite distance, a cheek perhaps, a ghost of civility. But Claire, who had spent most of her adult life standing quietly at the edges of other people's joy, reached up before he could step away. Her hand caught the lapel of his coat. Her eyes, clear as the harbor after rain, held his for a fraction longer than reason allowed. Then she kissed him. It wasn't long, it wasn't tender. It was a small, defiant fire struck in a cold room. The lawyer gasped, the foreman blinked, the minister fumbled for his closing prayer. Ben froze, the taste of salt and surprise lingering like lightning on the tongue. When she stepped back, her breath was steady. "There," she said quietly. "Now it looks real enough for your board of trustees." For a moment, something in him wanted to laugh or shout, he wasn't sure which. But the storm outside cracked through the silence, reminding them both why they were here. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document, and handed it to her. "Our agreement," he said. "A year." Then you're free. She looked down at the paper without taking it. Free is a strange word. Mr. Kincaid. It usually means someone else paid the price. Their eyes met again, not with heat, but with recognition, two people carrying debts no one else could see. The witnesses signed. The lawyer shook hands briskly, muttered something about good optics, and hurried into the rain. The minister offered blessings that blew away in the wind. Ben lingered a second too long before following, as if unsure what to do with the quiet she'd left behind. Claire remained inside, tracing the edge of the ring with her thumb, feeling its weight not heavy, but certain. When she stepped outside, the wind had shifted east, driving spray off the rocks below. Ben waited beside his truck, the engine running, headlights cutting through mist. He opened the passenger door without looking at her. She hesitated. "Do you always drive this fast after weddings?" "Only when I'm sober," he said, a hint of wryness beneath the monotone. She slid in, closed the door, and watched the chapel disappear behind them as they descended the hill. Somewhere below, the lighthouse beam swung across the water every 5 seconds, sweeping over the dark like a pulse. Neither spoke on the ride back. The wipers kept time, 1, 2, 3, like a slow metronome marking the seconds of a promise no one expected to keep. When they reached the house, Ben parked facing the sea. The porch light glowed amber through the fog. "Your room's upstairs," he said. "Second door on the left, fresh linens. You'll find the agreement on the desk." She gathered her coat around her shoulders. "You're efficient. I try. Cold, too." He looked at her, then really looked. "That helps," he said, "most of the time." She opened the truck door, the wind tugging at her hair. Before she went inside, she turned back. "Ben," she said, and waited until he met her eyes. "Next time you make a promise, make sure you know what you're swearing off." He didn't answer. When the door closed behind her, he sat a while, watching the faint light of the lighthouse flash and fade through the mist, steady, mechanical, indifferent, and tried not to feel the echo of her lips still burning on his skin. The house on Kincaid Hill looked solid from a distance, 3 stories of white clapboard, black shutters, and a porch that faced the sea as if it refused to turn away from whatever storms might come. Up close, it smelled faintly of lemon oil and cold metal. Claire stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was the silence. The second was the order. Every surface gleamed, books arranged by height, not by subject, kitchen towels folded into perfect squares. On the refrigerator door, a single list typed in small font, Monday grocery, fix railing invoice for dock repairs, Tuesday payroll, replace lantern oil, Wednesday. Silence. That one word made her pause. She read it twice, half expecting a joke that never arrived. From the hall, Ben's voice carried up the stairwell. "Your room's at the end of the hall. Fresh sheets. Try not to trip over the cat." "What cat?" she asked, turning. He was already gone. There was, of course, no cat. Just a long runner rug with perfectly even tassels and the slow, deliberate rhythm of a metronome ticking somewhere out of sight. She followed the sound to the kitchen. It sat on the counter beside the stove, brass pendulum moving with hypnotic precision, 60 beats per minute, a heartbeat too steady to be human. Next to it, a row of post-it notes in neat handwriting. "Do not move, do not wash, do not adjust." Claire stared at them for a moment, then muttered, "And definitely don't breathe." She exhaled slowly, as if afraid even that might set off an alarm. Her boots squeaked on the polished floor. A framed nautical map hung over the dining table, every harbor and channel marked in pencil, lines straight as piano strings. Under it, 3 coasters, aligned in a perfect triangle. She walked to the window, looking out at the harbor below. The fog had thinned to a silver veil. Lobster traps dotted the pier, and the lighthouse beams swung like a watchful eye. She wondered if Ben stood there every night, measuring the distance between light and darkness. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Ben stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, a faint smudge of graphite on his thumb. "Everything to your liking?" he asked. "It's..." She searched for a word that wouldn't sound like mockery. "Precise. That's one way to put it. You must never lose your keys. He didn't smile. Keys are replaceable. Order isn't. She let that hang between them, neither agreeing nor challenging. The house feels like it's holding its breath, she said finally. Ben looked past her to the metronome. That helps it remember to breathe. She studied him, the way his jaw clenched and released, as if something in him lived by the same tick. And what happens when the battery dies? Then I start again. It wasn't an answer, but she let it go. Upstairs, her room faced the water. Someone had thought to place a folded quilt at the end of the bed, a handmade one, patches of faded blue and cream, the only softness in the entire house. She set her suitcase down and noticed another posted on the mirror. Welcome, Claire. Please keep doors closed during storms. She laughed under her breath. I'll try not to offend the weather. When she unpacked, she found the dresser drawers lined with parchment paper that smelled faintly of cedar. Even her hangers were spaced an exact inch apart. She thought of her apartment in Portland, half-finished paintings, mismatched mugs, the soft chaos that came from living alone, and felt something pinch behind her ribs. Downstairs, the metronome clicked on. Tick, tick, tick. By late afternoon, she found the pantry and made tea. There were 12 mugs, all white, labeled with small pieces of masking tape. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. She chose Thursday out of rebellion. Ben returned from the yard carrying a stack of ledgers. He paused when he saw her sitting at the counter. That's not today's cup. I'm feeling ambitious, she said. I thought I'd skip ahead. For the first time, he almost smiled. Almost. I don't like surprises, he said. Neither do I, she replied. But they seem to like us. The corner of his mouth twitched, and for one fragile second, the air between them loosened. Then a low creak came from the hall, a sound like wood exhaling. Ben's expression shuddered. He set the ledgers down and strode toward the noise. Claire followed at a polite distance until he stopped at a closed door halfway down the hall. The doorknob was old brass, worn to a dull shine. He placed his hand on it, but didn't turn. Storage room, she asked. Something like that. The air around him changed tighter, thinner. I'd prefer you didn't go in there. She nodded. Of course. Later, after he left for the shipyard, curiosity pricked at her like sand under skin. She stood in front of the locked door, tea mug in hand, listening. Nothing, only the faint smell of salt and turpentine. A single frame hung above the knob, a sketch of the Grey Gull lighthouse, drawn in soft pencil. Beneath it, a date written in small letters, August 14th. She didn't know why that made her uneasy. She turned away, bumping her shoulder against a shelf near the stairwell. A box slid forward, teetered, and she caught it just before it hit the floor. The cardboard tore slightly at the corner, revealing a flash of silver. Inside was a framed photograph. Ben and a woman dark hair, laughing eyes standing at the base of the lighthouse. The wind had caught her scarf mid-spin, wrapping it around his arm. They looked like people who'd never heard of caution. Claire set the box down carefully. She meant to put the picture back, but the moment she lifted it, footsteps echoed behind her. Don't, Ben said. She froze. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of something that could break. He stepped forward, taking the frame from her hands as if it were made of glass filled with water. His fingers brushed hers cool, steady, deliberate. That's my wife, he said. Claire met his eyes. I figured. He set the frame back inside, closing the flaps with more care than force. For a long moment, neither moved. The metronome ticked downstairs, counting something neither of them wanted to name. I didn't mean to intrude, she said softly. I know. He turned away, voice quieter. Just, not that. She wanted to ask what he meant, what line she had stepped over, but the words tangled somewhere between curiosity and mercy. When he left, she stood alone in the hall, the faint scent of salt still rising from the photograph, wondering what kind of man lives by perfect order, only to keep one room locked against the past, and what kind of woman would be foolish enough to stay and find out. Outside, the foghorn moaned once, low and distant, like the world itself remembering loss. The following Monday brought wind, salt, and paperwork, all three in excess. At 10 o'clock, the lawyer from the Harbor Trust arrived, a tall man in a raincoat the color of oatmeal, briefcase clutched like a shield. He introduced himself as Mr. Horner, then shook their hands without smiling. The meeting took place in Ben's kitchen, where the metronome ticked quietly on the counter. Claire sat opposite, notebook open, her tea cooling by inches. Horner spread a stack of papers across the table, as if setting down a deck of bad cards. "Mr. Kincaid," he began, "your late father's trust stipulated that the Grey Gull property must remain under the stewardship of a married resident of Stonemere for at least 12 consecutive months. It's a clause about stability optics, community confidence." "Optics," Ben repeated, the word flat as slate. "Exactly. The trustees don't like sudden widowers or single businessmen controlling the harbor endowment. They prefer continuity. And if I fail to provide that illusion," Horner clasped his hands, "then the property reverts to the secondary bidder, Latham Marine Developments. They've made their interest clear." Claire looked toward the window. The gulls outside were circling low, screaming over the chop. Ben's jaw flexed once. "So, this farce keeps the vultures out. Fine." Horner cleared his throat. "You'll also need to attend 3 public events together in the next quarter. It demonstrates civic engagement. I've noted them here: the Harbor Guild potluck, the winter parade, and the spring lighthouse gala. Photos are often taken." Claire lifted her eyes. "You mean we have to look married, preferably," Horner said. She closed her notebook gently. "That's a new skill set for me." Horner didn't laugh. He packed up his files and rose, raincoat whispering, 12 months. "Miss Hadley, after that, the trust will review compliance, and you'll both be free." When the door shut behind him, the kitchen fell quiet except for the pendulum's slow swing. Ben stared at the stack of papers he'd already memorized. "I didn't ask you to like it." "I don't," Claire said, "but I understand it." He looked up. "That makes one of us." That afternoon, Claire walked down to the church hall, where she'd arranged to resume her volunteer work. The space smelled of dust, tempera paint, and old hymnals. A group of seniors and veterans gathered around long folding tables, watercolor sets spread like tiny rainbows. She greeted them with the ease of someone who knew how to listen before she spoke. "We're painting memories today," she said, "not masterpieces." Later, Ben appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. The sight of her surrounded by color seemed to surprise him. She wore a smock splattered with paint, hair pulled back with a pencil. A veteran named Tommy was laughing over his attempt to paint a gull that looked suspiciously like a chicken. Claire looked up, checking for community engagement already. "Making sure you're still breathing," he said. "You sound disappointed." He hesitated. "More relieved. Maybe." Their eyes met for half a second before she turned back to her students. He left without another word. By the end of the week, the invitation arrived: the Harbor Guild potluck, printed on thick cream paper, embossed in navy. To celebrate the guardians of Stonemere's light, it read. Ben drove them there on Friday evening. The event was held in the upper hall of the Maritime Museum, beneath a model ship suspended from the ceiling. Tables groaned under casseroles and pies, the air full of sugar and gossip. The moment they walked in, conversations slowed, a few smiles, mostly polite. People had opinions about hasty weddings, and small towns are ecosystems of speculation. Claire straightened her shoulders, smoothing the navy dress she'd borrowed from her cousin. Ben wore his usual uniform gray shirt, clean lines, silence. Mrs. Marlene Duffy, who organized every guild function since the 1980s, approached first. "Well, Ben," she said, voice sugar-dipped in curiosity. "We were all so surprised. Hardly anyone even knew you were courting." Ben opened his mouth, closed it again. Claire offered a warm smile. "Neither did we. Marlene. Life moves faster than the tide sometimes." The woman blinked, unsure if she'd been outmaneuvered. Then she laughed. Ain't that the truth? As they moved through the crowd, Claire noticed the way people's eyes followed them, half interest, half doubt. Someone whispered, "Paper marriage." Another said, "Pity she doesn't know what she's in for." Ben heard it too. His shoulders tightened. She leaned closer. "If you glare any harder, they'll salt the punch." He exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "I'm not built for small talk. Then let me do the talking." They reached the buffet. She took a plate, then another, stacking deviled eggs like peace offerings. When they sat, conversation at the table fluttered awkwardly. Someone asked how long they'd known each other. Someone else mentioned the lighthouse restoration. Claire listened, responding with small, calm answers. She noticed Ben's hand hovering once near the small of her back, an instinct maybe, protection, then retreating like a tide unsure of its shore. Dessert came, pecan pie, slightly burnt around the edges. The murmurs rose again, half admiring, half dissecting. Claire felt the weight of it like static on her skin. She tapped her glass with a fork. "May I?" she asked. The room quieted. "I'm new to this town," she began, voice even, "and I suppose some of you are wondering what brings me here. Truth is, I came because I believe in keeping lights lit for sailors, for families, for anyone who's ever looked out at the dark and hoped someone was watching. Stonemere's lighthouse has done that for generations. I think our job, all of us, is to keep it shining." Her words settled over the room like a tide going out, leaving calm behind. Someone sighed. "Mrs. Duffy dabbed her eyes. Ben looked at her as if seeing something he hadn't planned on finding, not beauty exactly, but steadiness, the kind of strength that doesn't ask to be noticed. After a long pause, applause rippled through the hall, then laughter, real and easy. The air shifted, suspicion thinned. Even the rival developer's envoy, sitting near the punch bowl, offered a curt nod. Ben leaned toward her. "You didn't have to do that. I know," she said softly, "but you looked like you were about to combust." "I don't combust." "Then consider it preventative maintenance." He almost smiled. When they left, the harbor fog had lifted. The night smelled of pine and diesel fuel. Claire walked a few paces ahead, her heels clicking on the dock planks. Ben watched the way she carried herself calm, deliberate as if she'd already learned to balance in his world of measured steps. He didn't reach for her, not even when a gust nearly took her hat. But his fingers twitched once at his side, a reflex caught halfway between instinct and permission. She noticed. Without turning, she said quietly, "You don't have to touch me to steady me, Ben." He looked out toward the lighthouse beam cutting through the dark one flash, then another, and wondered if that was true. Morning light spilled through the stained glass windows of Stonemere's small church, scattering color across the worn piano. Claire struck a single note, middle C, and the sound trembled before settling into the air like dust in sunlight. Around her, a dozen older voices rose in tentative unison, some wavering, some surprisingly sure. She stood in the center of the choir room, sleeves rolled, hair pinned carelessly, coaxing rhythm out of hesitation. "Breathe from here," she said, touching her chest. "Not here." She tapped her throat. "And don't worry about the notes. Worry about the truth under them." Laughter rippled through the group. Tommy, the veteran who painted gulls like chickens, grinned from the back row. "You make it sound like confession." Claire smiled. "Maybe it is." Outside, beyond the churchyard, the rhythmic clatter of hammers echoed from the shipyard. The two sounds, human and mechanical, braided through the wind until they became something like a conversation neither side knew it was having. Down by the docks, Ben Kincaid measured the keel of a 38-foot trawler, pencil balanced behind his ear. He'd been at it since dawn, marking and remarking the cedar planks until each one lined up within a 16th of an inch. The men under him moved efficiently, the way sailors do when they know their captain sees everything. "Watch your spacing. Reggie," he called. "Already fixed it. Boss." Ben grunted approval, then paused. From across the water came the faintest thread of music voices rising, hesitant, uneven. He knew the tune. His mother used to hum it while mending nets. He looked up toward the church steeple. The door was open. For reasons he couldn't name, he set the pencil down. Up on the hill, Claire's choir stumbled into the final verse of Shenandoah. The altos cracked, the tenors gave up halfway, and Tommy, God bless him, came in a beat late every time. But it was beautiful in its own crooked way, honest sound filling a space too long starved for it. When she ended, applause scattered like rain on tin. She turned toward the doorway and saw a figure standing outside, tall, arms crossed, hat in hand. Ben, she waved. You looking for redemption or repairs? He blinked, as if unsure how to answer. Sound carries, he said finally. Good thing, most of them are half deaf. He started to leave, but she added, You can come in, you know? It's not contagious. He stepped over the threshold, eyes flicking to the hymnals stacked by the door, the piano missing a key, the smell of old varnish that clung to everything. I'm not much of a singer. Neither are they, she said, but that's not why they come. He studied her for a moment. Why do they? Then she hesitated. To remember what their lungs can still do, to make noise that doesn't hurt. Something in him softened, barely. He nodded once and left without another word. Later that week, Claire visited the shipyard to drop off donation forms for the restoration project. The air smelled of cedar shavings and salt, the ground slick with sawdust. Workers shouted over engines, gulls circling like hecklers overhead. Ben was crouched beside the trawler, measuring again. You'll wear that ruler down to dust, she called. He looked up, squinting against the glare. Accuracy keeps the ocean out. Perfection doesn't, she countered. That earned a short, reluctant smile. She watched the way he ran his hands along the plank edges, the same care she used when tuning a choir listening for something invisible. When he straightened, she noticed the small patch of sawdust in his hair. Without thinking, she reached out to brush it away, but stopped herself halfway. His eyes caught the motion. She lowered her hand. You missed a spot, he said. I'll survive. The sound of varnish mixing machines filled the air, pungent and sharp. It drifted up the hill toward the church where her class had gathered again. At first, she didn't notice the shift. Tommy was painting quietly when his brush began to tremble. That smell, he whispered. That damn smell. His breath quickened, eyes darting toward the window. Claire was beside him in a heartbeat. Tommy, look at me. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. He shook his head, hands clenching. It's the same smell from the docks in Kuwait. The fire. Stay here, she said softly. You're safe. Just air and paint, nothing more. He tried, failed, then tried again. Claire matched her breath to his until the rhythm steadied. The others fell silent, watching. Outside, Ben stood by the trawler, noticing the stillness that had fallen over the churchyard. The faint echo of Claire's voice carried down the wind, calm, deliberate. He caught the word breathe and understood. Without a sound, he gestured to the crew. Shut down the Sanders. The noise died instantly. Engines clicked off. Even the gulls seemed to hush. Up in the church, Tommy lifted his head, confusion flickering into relief. The air cleared. Claire smiled, hand still on his shoulder. There now, no varnish, just wind. When she looked out the window, the shipyard lay quiet, every machine stilled. Ben met her gaze from below. One hand raised in acknowledgement. She returned it, palm open. No words. No thanks, just understanding. The choir resumed minutes later. Voices softer now, but steadier. Ben watched for a while, then turned back to the boat, running his thumb along the new keel line. One of his men asked, Boss, we stopping for long enough? Ben said. He didn't explain why. That evening, Claire locked up the church and started down the hill. The sun was melting into the horizon, throwing molten light across the harbor. At the docks, she found him stacking tools. You didn't have to stop work, she said. He kept his eyes on the planks. It wasn't hard. It cost you time. Not as much as it cost him. She wanted to thank him, but something about his tone made her stay quiet. Instead, she said, "You run this place like a symphony." He raised an eyebrow. "More like a storm. Storms clear the air." They stood side by side, watching the lighthouse begin its slow rotation, one flash, then dark, then flash again. After a moment, Ben said quietly, "You have a good voice." She smiled. "You heard it from the doorway." "From the water," he corrected. "It carries better there." Their eyes met in the dimming light, the distance between them smaller than before, but still measured in unspoken things. Then he turned back toward the trawler, hands steady once more. She walked away, the echo of his voice mingling with the faint hum of the sea. Somewhere between the choir room and the boatyard, two rhythms, human and mechanical, had found a way to breathe together. The storm arrived like a freight train wrapped in fog. By nightfall, the wind had built to a steady roar, driving sheets of rain against the windows until the glass shuddered in its frame. Ben moved through the house with practiced precision, checking latches, sealing drafts, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning. Claire stood at the kitchen sink, watching the sea vanish behind a curtain of white spray. "It's like the world's being erased," she said quietly. "It'll redraw itself by morning." Ben replied. He said it with the same certainty he used for tides, as if faith were a matter of arithmetic. Then the lights went out. A deep hum died through the walls, followed by the small, shocked silence that follows every blackout. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter banged. Ben reached for the counter by memory. "Lantern's in the pantry." "I'll get it," Claire said. But he was already there, opening the door, moving by instinct. A moment later, the soft scrape of a match flared gold, throwing light against the room. The oil lantern caught, its glass chimney glowing amber, shadows leaping like breath on the ceiling. Claire exhaled. "That's better." He adjusted the wick, eyes narrowed against the brightness. The storm howled harder. "Power lines won't be back till morning," he said. She pulled a chair toward the table. "Then we wait." He sat opposite, the lantern between them. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls. Inside, the flame swayed, fragile but steady. Claire studied his hands. They rested on the table, strong, capable, slightly trembling. She pretended not to see it. "You've done this before," she said. "Storms." He almost smiled. "Too many to count." "No," she said softly. "Enduring them." He looked at her, then really looked as if measuring the distance between what she knew and what she guessed. "You get used to it. Do you?" He didn't answer. The clock ticked somewhere down the hall. The storm filled every pause. Claire traced a circle on the table with her finger, the wood smooth and cool. "My mother used to love nights like this," she said. "When the power went out, she'd light a candle and make me sing with her. Said it kept the fear busy." Ben tilted his head. "Did it? Sometimes?" She smiled faintly. "When she was dying. The hospice had this tiny chapel, 2 pews, 1 lamp. I sang while she slept. My voice cracked on the high notes, but she smiled anyway. We sang until the breath unspooled like a thread. The lantern hissed softly." He looked at her across the flame. "That's a beautiful way to say goodbye." "It was," she said, until I realized it wasn't goodbye. It was permission. For her to leave, for me to stay. Ben's throat moved, but no sound came. A flash of lightning lit the window. Thunder followed so close, it felt like the sky split open above them. The lantern flickered wildly. Claire reached forward, steadying it with her hand. When the light steadied again, she noticed his hands gripping the edge of the table, white-knuckled, shaking harder now. "You all right?" she asked. He forced a breath. "Fine." "Ben," I said I'm fine. But his voice betrayed him a crack too human to hide. She leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to be." He stared at the lantern flame. "You don't understand." "Then tell me." He shook his head. "Talking doesn't change it." "Maybe not," she said gently. "But silence doesn't either." The wind wailed through the chimney, a hollow moan that made the whole house sound alive. He closed his eyes for a moment, jaw tight, breath shallow. Then, before he could stop himself, he said it. "I don't touch because when I do, I remember pulling her from the water." The words hung between them like glass about to break. Claire didn't move. The lantern flared suddenly, flame leaping higher as if feeding on the confession. Shadows danced up the walls, wild and trembling. He kept his gaze fixed on the table. The boat flipped fast. I went under after her. When I found her, her hair. He stopped, voice breaking. It caught in the rigging. I tried to free it. She looked right at me. I felt her slip before I could. He swallowed hard. Every time I touch someone, it's like I'm back there, losing her all over again. The storm crashed against the roof, but neither of them flinched. Claire's hand twitched, wanting to reach across the table, to offer some human tether, but she stayed still. "You couldn't have saved her," she said quietly. He gave a small, bitter laugh. "That's the thing. I keep trying to prove I can save something. The house, the yard, the rules, all of it. And it never adds up." She looked at him through the wavering light. "You're not fixing her memory. Ben, you're punishing yourself with it." The lantern hissed again, shrinking then swelling as if breathing their words. He leaned back, eyes on the flame. "You have a way of saying things that sound simple but aren't. Occupational hazard," she said. "Art therapy. We call it controlled mess." That pulled a quiet laugh from him, dry, startled. "Controlled mess," he repeated. "Exactly. You can't stop the chaos, but you can decide what colors it takes." Outside, a gust slammed against the shutters, shaking the glass. He rose to secure the latch, movements deliberate. When he turned back, his face softened in the lamplight, all edges and exhaustion. "Thanks," he said, "for talking. Anytime." She answered. They sat without speaking for a long while. The storm began to fade, the thunder rolling farther out to sea. The lantern's light steadied to a calm, rhythmic glow. At some point, Claire drifted into a doze, her head resting against the back of the chair. Ben watched her, the relaxed line of her jaw, the steady rise and fall of her breath. The metronome in the kitchen had stopped, but he found a different rhythm, now the quiet tick of rain easing against the windows, matching her breathing. He reached out once, almost without realizing it, his hand hovering above hers, no closer than an inch. The warmth of the lantern brushed his skin. He stayed there, unmoving, until the last echo of thunder dissolved. Then he pulled his hand back slowly, as if releasing something fragile to the dark. The flame flickered one last time, then held steady, its glow painting both their faces in the same soft gold. The boathouse had never looked so dressed up. Strings of white lights draped from the rafters, throwing reflections across the polished wood floor where the smell of salt and pine sap mingled with perfume and champagne. The annual Harbor Holiday Gala was Stonemere's most public night and the first true test of how convincingly Ben Kincaid and Claire Hadley could pretend to be in love. Claire adjusted her coat in the truck's window reflection before stepping out. "You didn't tell me there'd be photographers." Ben glanced toward the entrance, where a volunteer aimed a disposable camera at each couple. "There aren't usually. Then tonight's special." "Tonight's a trap," he said dryly. Inside, the place buzzed with polite conversation, silver trays, the occasional polite laugh of someone being carefully watched. The rival developer, Gregory Latham, stood near the bar in a tailored navy suit, holding court. His smile looked like it had been ironed into place. Ben caught the man's eye, gave a curt nod. Latham's answering grin was slow, predatory. Claire leaned closer. "That the gull or the vulture depends on the wind." They entered together, and the whispers began almost immediately soft currents in the candlelight. "That's her. The quick wedding. Pretty, though. I thought he'd never remarry." Claire let the murmur wash over her. If she'd learned anything from her mother's hospice ward, it was that people fill silence with whatever they fear most. She smiled anyway. Ben signed a few donation forms, shook hands with people who wanted to be photographed near the man who owned the last working shipyard in town. Claire stood by, calm, collected, playing her part. Then came Marla Pierce, Ben's late wife's sister, red dress, wine glass, a voice too smooth for the words it carried. "Ben," she said, leaning in for a kiss on the cheek that didn't quite land. "It's been forever." Marla. Her eyes slid to Claire. "And this must be the new Mrs. Kincaid? How unexpected. Unexpected things keep life interesting," Claire said evenly. Marla smiled thin, precise, or complicated. "Paper marriages often are." Ben's shoulders tensed, but Claire rested a hand lightly on his arm, stopping him. "Paper burns fast," she said, voice soft but clear, "and yet it keeps the flame alive just long enough to light something else." The surrounding conversation paused just a heartbeat, then moved on. Marla blinked, caught off guard, then laughed too loudly. "Well," she said, "you certainly have a way with words." "She's a choir teacher," Ben said. "Words behave for her." Marla's gaze sharpened. "How nice. Your first wife was tone deaf." "Marla." His voice had that warning note she knew too well. She raised her glass, unbothered, and drifted away into the crowd. Claire watched her go. Family dinners must be lively. "There aren't any," he said. The band struck up a fiddle tune, a waltz old enough that everyone knew the steps. Couples began to move across the floor, skirts brushing, laughter rising above the storm outside. Claire looked toward the lights strung along the beams. "You don't dance, do you? Not in public?" "Private dancing sounds intriguing." His glance was sharp, startled. Then he realized she was teasing. "Come on," she said. "We need to sell the illusion. The trustees will want photos." He hesitated, then offered his arm like a man stepping into battle. She took it, her hand light on his sleeve. They stepped onto the floor. He counted the rhythm under his breath. 1, 2, 3 precision, even in this. She followed easily, surprising him. "Relax," she murmured. "You're leading a person, not a plank. Old habits." They turned once, twice, finding a strange alignment. Her perfume carried hints of bergamot and something faintly sweet, like cedar smoke. "You know," she said quietly, "you're not half bad. Don't spread that around." The tune quickened, laughter rippled through the dancers. He let himself almost enjoy it, the warmth, the motion, the strange awareness of her hand near his heart. For a moment, the world felt less like a contract and more like a pulse. Then, as the song shifted keys, someone brushed past too close. Claire stumbled, one heel slipping on the polished floor. She caught herself against him, her hand against his chest. Their faces were suddenly inches apart. Her breath hitched, his eyes darkened, wide with surprise. The movement should have ended there, polite laughter, quick recovery, but she steadied herself too slowly. Her mouth grazed his, just barely. A spark caught between apology and accident. He froze. The air seemed to vanish. The bow of the fiddle screeched, the musician missing a note, startled by something he couldn't see. The room turned to look. Ben stepped back, too fast. "Sorry," he said hoarsely. The single word cut the music clean in half. Claire blinked, realizing too late what everyone else must have seen: the rigid man, the accidental kiss, the flush of color on her throat. The band faltered, then stopped altogether. Silence dropped like a stone. Marla's voice floated from the back. "Well," she said with mock sweetness, "looks like the honeymoon's over." Laughter, awkward and thin, rippled through the room. Claire straightened, dignity like armor. "It never started," she said. "We prefer substance to spectacle." The remark drew a few nervous chuckles. Someone called for another tune. The band scrambled to oblige, launching into something too lively, too loud. Ben had already turned toward the exit, jaw clenched. Claire followed at a measured pace, head high, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her palms. Outside, cold air rushed around them, biting through the night. The harbor lights shimmered against the black water. She stopped on the dock. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly. "He faced the sea? I do? That shouldn't have happened. It didn't," she said, voice steady. "Not really." He turned, eyes catching the lamplight. "You think that makes it easier?" "No," she whispered, "just bearable." Wind whipped her hair across her face. He looked as though he might say something, an apology, a truth. She couldn't tell, but he only shook his head, stepping back into the shadows. The music drifted faintly from the boathouse, distant and bright, while the two of them stood on the dock between darkness and light, each pretending not to feel what the other already knew. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor, once, twice, and for a heartbeat. They were both caught in its glow, still as ghosts. The Grey Gull lighthouse stood at the farthest tip of the harbor, a narrow tower of stone and glass watching over the sea like a weary sentinel. The town had turned its lower rooms into a small museum decades ago, filled with nautical charts, faded logbooks, and relics too heavy to throw away. Claire arrived mid-morning, the air sharp with salt and old paint. She carried a clipboard under one arm, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The trust had asked her to help catalog donations for the upcoming community exhibit, a project she'd volunteered for, partly out of duty, partly to avoid the silence of the house. Ben had left early for the yard, saying little beyond, "Watch your step on the stairs. They creak." He didn't mention the lighthouse had once been his wife's favorite place. The museum room was smaller than she expected, walls lined with maritime maps and frames that had gone amber with age. A brass telescope leaned against the window, its lens fogged by years of salt air. Everything smelled faintly of oil and memory. She began with the donation boxes stacked near the door, old logbooks, postcards, a handful of model ships. Each item she labeled, measured, and noted. It was a kind of order she could live with, one born from quiet rather than control. Halfway through the second crate, a folded chart slipped free and drifted to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, her fingers brushed something lodged behind the shelf, a narrow envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed but never stamped. It was addressed in looping handwriting to B. Kincaid. The ink had bled slightly from age, but the date was still legible, September 9th, 3 weeks after the storm that had taken his wife. For a long moment, Claire just held it. The paper was soft, fragile, as if handled too many times before being hidden. She turned it over, no return name, no message visible through the thin parchment. Her first instinct was to open it. Curiosity hummed through her fingertips. But then came something else in ache, like trespassing on a locked room in someone's heart. She set it on the table, staring at it as if it might reveal its story on its own. Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks, each wave folding into the next. When she finally moved, it was with the care of someone handling something sacred. She placed the envelope in a small archival sleeve and slipped it into her satchel. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual. Clouds gathered low, blurring the horizon into pewter. Ben was in the workshop when she returned, sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his arms. He didn't look up when she stepped in. "You're early," he said. "Finished ahead of schedule." She replied, "The museum's smaller than I thought. Everything's smaller once you take the ghosts out." She hesitated, watching the way he measured a plank, precise to the millimeter, the same old rhythm order against chaos. "Ben," she said quietly, "I found something." That made him pause. What kind of something? She opened her satchel, drew out the sealed letter, and set it gently on the workbench. He frowned, wiping his hands on a rag before taking it. When he saw the handwriting, his expression changed, not shock, not grief exactly, but recognition, as if a door long nailed shut had just whispered open. "Where did you get this?" "Behind a chart at the Lighthouse Museum," she said. "It must have been tucked there years ago." He traced the writing with his thumb, lips parting slightly. "This is—" He stopped. "This is her handwriting." Claire said nothing. He swallowed hard. The date. 3 weeks after his voice faltered. "I didn't think she ever wrote me after the storm." She might have, Claire said softly. Maybe she didn't have a chance to send it. He nodded absently, eyes still on the envelope. Do you want me to go? She asked. No. His voice was rough. Stay. He set the letter down on the table, staring at it as if it might vanish. The workshop clock ticked. Outside, gulls cried above the surf. After a long silence, he said, You didn't open it? No. Why not? It wasn't mine. His gaze lifted to hers, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. Most people would have looked. I'm not most people. A small, humorless smile touched his mouth. No. You're not? He turned the letter over again, fingers trembling slightly. I can't, not yet. You don't have to, she said. I should. She shook her head. There's a difference between should and ready. He studied her for a long moment, then set the letter aside, as though the weight of it had become too much. You ever find something that feels like it's been waiting for you, and you're not sure you want it to? Yes, she said. Once. What was it? My mother's voice on a voicemail I'd forgotten to delete. He nodded slowly, understanding without asking more. The light in the workshop dimmed as the clouds thickened. The smell of sawdust and salt mingled with the faint scent of old paper. Ben leaned on the bench, his hand still near the letter. Thank you for bringing it. Of course, he exhaled. You could have thrown it away. I thought about it, she admitted, but it didn't feel like mine to end. Something in his face loosened, not a smile, not quite forgiveness, but the easing of a knot he'd lived with so long, he'd forgotten where it began. They stood in silence for a while. The storm outside hadn't yet arrived, but the wind had begun to hum through the eaves, the same low note the lighthouse always carried when the weather turned. Finally, Ben straightened, sliding the envelope into his coat pocket. I'll read it when I'm ready, he said quietly. She nodded. That's all it asks. He looked at her again, steady this time, as if something invisible had shifted. Claire. Yes. Thank you for not being curious. She almost laughed. That's the nicest accusation I've ever received. The corners of his mouth twitched. It's meant to be. As she turned to leave, he called after her. Claire. She paused at the doorway. If I read it and it changes something, would you want to know? She hesitated. Only if you want to tell me. He nodded once. Fair enough. When she stepped outside, the air had gone colder, the first drops of rain tapping against her sleeves. She looked back through the window. Ben stood alone in the workshop, lantern light falling across his hands as he unfolded a piece of history that still had the power to break him, or perhaps, this time, to save him. She walked toward the shore, the wind lifting her hair, the lighthouse beam sweeping across the water like an old heart remembering how to beat. The tide had gone out, leaving the breakwater slick with mist and the glimmer of wet stones. The morning was gray, the kind of gray that flattened everything horizon, heart, memory. Ben stood at the end of the jetty, the letter folded neatly in his pocket, as if proximity to the sea might make the words easier to face. He'd carried it around for days, touched it, avoided it, memorized its weight without daring to break the seal. The envelope had become a small, private war one he was losing quietly. Now, the wind pulled at his coat, and the gulls shrieked overhead, impatient. He tore the envelope open. The paper inside was brittle, its edges frayed, the ink slightly blurred. He read the first line and stopped breathing. Ben, if you're reading this, the sea has already decided something we couldn't. His wife's handwriting curved like a voice he could still hear precise, looping, unhurried. Don't try to fix what the sea will always take. Live. Please live. The words blurred as he blinked. He'd always believed she'd written, Don't love again, the sentence he'd punished himself with for years. But the letter said the opposite. He folded it again, pressed it to his chest, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, more like a breath remembered too late. Footsteps behind him broke the spell. Ben Clare's voice carried softly through the wind. You didn't come home last night. He didn't turn immediately. Couldn't sleep. Neither could I. She stopped a few feet away, coat wrapped tight around her. I guessed I'd find you here. He managed a faint smile. You're getting good at reading me. Not that good, she said gently. You're still a book in a locked drawer. He looked down at the letter in his hand. Maybe not locked anymore. She waited. He unfolded the paper again, eyes tracing the words like a man tracing scars. I thought I remembered it, he said. The last note she wrote. I told myself it said, don't love again. I built everything on that, this house, this silence, every rule I made. Claire stepped closer, careful on the wet stones, and it didn't. He shook his head. It said, don't try to fix what the sea will always take. And then, live. His voice cracked on the last word. I turned a mercy into a sentence. The wind lifted her hair, the sea hissed against the rocks below. That's what grief does, she said softly. It translates love into punishment, so it doesn't have to let go. He let out a bitter laugh. I've been living like the ocean's an enemy, but it wasn't the sea that killed her. Not really. It was the storm and me trying to control what couldn't be controlled. She watched him, saying nothing, letting the truth find its own tide. He took a step back from the edge, staring at the letter. She was braver than I ever gave her credit for. She must have written this before the storm, knowing how stubborn I'd be. Maybe she knew you'd keep fixing things until you broke yourself. Too late, he said quietly. Claire shook her head. You're standing here, aren't you? He met her eyes then, something unguarded in his expression. Because of you. She blinked. No. Ben, because of you finally wanting to live. He laughed once, a small, rough sound. You have a way of making pain sound like philosophy. It's not philosophy, she said. It's survival. The difference is that one you think about, the other you just do. The wind gusted, whipping the letter from his hand. It tumbled toward the rocks below. Without thinking, she reached for it, caught the edge just before it fell into the tide pool. They both stared at her hand clutching the fragile paper, rain spattering the ink. Ben's shoulders dropped. You just saved my last piece of her. Claire handed it back gently. No. I think she saved you first. He held it against his chest again, head bowed. I've spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length. The rules helped. No touch, no chance of hurting anyone again, or being hurt. He nodded, shame washing over his face. You saw what happened at the gala. I still can't, Ben, she said, and the tone in her voice stilled him. That wasn't a mistake. It was a heartbeat. You just didn't know what to do with it. He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing her for the first time under full daylight. The damp strands of hair across her forehead, the calm steadiness in her eyes, the small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she tucked it into her coat pocket. Claire, he began, and stopped. His hand lifted halfway toward her face, fingers trembling. She didn't move, but she didn't back away either. His fingertips hovered inches from her cheek, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin. Then his hand dropped suddenly, his voice breaking on a single word. I can't. Yes, she said quietly. You can. He shook his head. If I touch you, I'll remember what it felt like to lose her. Her eyes softened. Then maybe it's time you let your hands remember something else. He looked down at his palms as though they belonged to someone else. They were rough, lined with work, calloused from a lifetime of building and repairing. The same hands that had once pulled wreckage from a storm now trembled, empty. Claire stepped closer, so near that the hem of her coat brushed his. Hands can remember kindness too. Ben, she said, her voice barely above the wind, you just have to let them. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries cutting through the gray. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Ben nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a truth too long postponed. He folded the letter again, tucking it inside his jacket near his heart. She told me to live, he said softly. I think that starts with not being afraid of the living. Seems like a good place to start, Claire murmured. They turned toward the shore together, the sea washing against the rocks below, erasing every footprint as soon as it appeared. Behind them, the lighthouse beams swept across the mist, one long, steady arc of light that found them both, and lingered for a heartbeat before moving on. News in Stonemere travels the way wind moves over water fast, loud, and slightly distorted. By noon, half the harbor knew Gregory Latham had filed a petition with the trust board, complete with photographs, affidavits, and a glossy binder that smelled like expensive ink. Claire saw the first picture on her phone, a printout slipped under the church hall door. It showed her and Ben at the harbor gala, frozen in that awkward, not quite kiss. His body angled away, her mouth parted in surprise. Across the image, someone had stamped in red contract marriage. She closed the folder, smoothed the paper as if it were a wrinkled sheet, and carried it uphill. Ben was in the yard, hoisting a length of cedar with Reggie. When he saw her face, he lowered the plank without a word. She held up the photo. He didn't flinch, but something in his jaw locked. "Latham," he asked. "Who else?" she said. "He petitioned the board this morning. Claims our marriage is a sham to hold the endowment." Ben wiped his hands on a rag, slow, controlled. "When's the hearing?" 10 days, she said. "If the board agrees with him, the yard and the lighthouse revert to Latham's company." Reggie swore under his breath. Man would pave the shoals if he could charge admission. Ben put the rag down. "We'll show the board they're wrong." Claire nodded, but her stomach felt like a fist. "They'll want proof that's more than photographs. They'll want life." Ben met her eyes. "Then we give them ours." That afternoon, he called Mr. Horner. The lawyer's voice carried the dry rattle of a man allergic to surprises. "Latham's petition argues lack of marital intimacy," Horner said, as if the phrase itself might stain the phone. "He has witnesses who claim you sleep in separate rooms." "We do," Ben said evenly. "By choice." "Choice is not a violation," Claire added. "The clause is about stability and community presence." "Agreed," Horner said. "But optics matter. Be prepared." After the call, Ben stood very still, like a man balancing on a narrow plank. "I won't ask you to perform," he said. "You won't need to," she answered. "We'll tell the truth and let it stand." He looked relieved and something more complicated, grateful, protective. "You shouldn't have to carry this weight. Neither should you," she said. "But here we are." The 10 days moved like a tide caught between storms, slow, relentless. Latham's people circulated more photos, the two of them stepping into the boathouse separately, Claire returning alone from the lighthouse, Ben at dawn on the pier with a thermos and no ring visible because his gloves covered it. Each image came with a caption that suggested absence where there had been simply quiet. Stonemere split into those who shook their heads and those who whispered. Mrs. Marlene Duffy brought over a casserole in righteous indignation. "I told Earl," she said, "if that man touches our lighthouse, I'll chain myself to the lens and sing Amazing Grace until he repents." Claire laughed despite herself. "Please don't get arrested on my behalf. I've always wanted to try handcuffs." "Mrs. Duffy said gravely. "For justice." On the 9th evening, snow started, dry and fine as sifted flour. Ben came in late, the smell of cold clinging to his coat. He set the metronome on the counter, 60 beats per minute, and poured coffee into the dented stainless thermos he used every morning. Without thinking, he poured a second cup and slid it to her. As he did most dawns, she looked at the shared steam rising between them. "Tomorrow," she said, "we tell them about the thermos." "It's nothing," he said. "It's everything," she answered. "Small things always are." He didn't argue. The trust board met in a paneled room above the Maritime Museum. The chairs were uncomfortable on purpose, the windows narrow, the ceiling hung with the model of a clipper ship that looked capable of sailing away if the meeting ran long. On one side of the table sat the trustees, wool-clad and stern. On the other sat Latham with his starched binder. In the center, Horner with his careful notes. And near the door, a handful of townspeople pretending they weren't listening. Ben wore his good shirt. Claire wore a dark sweater and the kind of calm she put on like a coat. Latham went first, because men like him always do. He clicked through photographs with a remote, each image landing on the white screen like a gavel. "You'll notice," he said, "consistent physical distance, separate arrivals and departures, a pattern of staged appearances for public events only. The trust requires a marriage of stability. This is theater." Horner coughed politely. "The clause does not define intimacy." "Mr. Latham." "Then allow me to," Latham said, smiling. "Intimacy is not post-its and parallel lives." Ben didn't look at him. He watched the trustees instead, reading their faces like weather. When it was their turn, Horner nodded to Claire. "Miss Hadley." She stood not stiff, not defiant, just steady. "I'm not here to talk about romance," she began. "I'm here to talk about mornings." A few eyebrows rose. She continued, voice even. "Every day at 5:30, the house wakes. He sets a metronome in the kitchen, 60 beats a minute. He says it keeps the house breathing. He pours coffee into a dented thermos. Leaves half for me in a mug labeled Thursday, no matter what day it is, because he knows I prefer that one. On storm days, he checks the windows twice but pretends he doesn't, so I won't worry. At the shipyard, he shut down sanding for an hour because a veteran in my class couldn't breathe through the smell. He didn't make an announcement. He just did it. Silence settled, light as snowfall. She went on. He labels things because he's lost things. He locks one room because it holds a past he still pays for. He doesn't touch because his hands remember a night none of us can fix. But every morning, he pours coffee. Every morning, he listens for the wind. Every morning, he chooses to keep the light. One trustee, an older woman with a scarf in lighthouse stripes, blinked hard and dabbed her eye. Latham shifted in his chair, frowning. Claire took a breath. "I can't speak for what a marriage should look like in a binder. I can only tell you what it looks like in a kitchen when the power's out oil lantern. Two people who don't pretend to be anything other than what they are, and a choice to stay. If the trust wants proof of community, come see the choir on Tuesdays, the yard on Thursdays, the way the lighthouse keeps watch even when no one's looking. That's intimacy where I'm from." She sat. The room stayed quiet an extra beat, the way rooms do when someone has said something they weren't prepared to hear. Horner cleared his throat. "Thank you. Miss Hadley?" He glanced at the board. "Madam Chair." The chairwoman folded her hands. "This board appreciates testimony tied to the spirit of the clause, not just the letter." She looked from Latham's binder to Ben's still hands. "However, these are serious allegations, and our responsibility is to the community. We will delay our vote for 2 weeks and request community evidence, letters, statements, observation of daily life at the lighthouse and yard. If what we hear aligns with Miss Hadley's account, we'll consider this petition unfounded." Latham leaned forward. With respect," the chair said. "The light doesn't belong to you yet." A murmur traveled the room like wind through rigging. Ben exhaled a sound so low only Claire heard it. She placed her palm flat on the table, an inch from his, not touching, close enough to mean it. Outside, snow ticked softly against the windows. People began to rise, boots scuffing on old wood. Marlene Duffy squeezed Claire's shoulder as she passed, whispering, "I'll bring the whole choir if I have to." They walked out into the delicate white hush of Main Street, breath visible in the air. Ben stopped on the museum steps, staring at nothing and everything his shipyard, the lighthouse, the thin line where sea met sky. "They asked for proof," he said, voice quiet. Claire nodded. "Then we let them see us." He looked down at her hand, still resting on the cold railing. For a moment, it seemed like he might cover it with his own. The metronome inside him sped, then steadied. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she repeated. The first flake landed on her sleeve, melting instantly here, and then gone, but still felt. The Harbor Open House began as an idea over coffee and exhaustion. 2 weeks after the board hearing, the tension in town had thickened like ice. Claire proposed something simple, a day where everyone could see what was worth saving. Not speeches, she said, just doors open. The choir, the veterans, the shipyard workers, let them show what this place does. Ben looked skeptical. You think cookies and songs will change a trust vote? I think people will, she replied. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. But if you're organizing the choir, I'm in charge of safety codes. Deal, she said, and smiled. The morning of the event arrived crisp and clear, sunlight scattering diamonds across the harbor ice. Steam rose from the vents of clam chowder pots set along the pier. The church bell rang 9 times the signal to begin. At the shipyard, Ben oversaw the plank steaming demonstration. A long wooden box hissed with vapor, the scent of cedar filling the cold air. Children pressed close to see how the wet wood bent gracefully under pressure. This is how you keep a boat from breaking, Ben explained to a small boy clutching a cup of cocoa. You teach the wood to yield before it snaps. Claire, across the dock, was setting up canvases for the senior art display. Watercolors of gulls, the lighthouse, and winter roses fluttered in the wind. She arranged them by hue, not skill blues near blues, ochres beside sunlight. The choir warmed up under the awning, voices rising and falling, fragile at first, but steadying together. Tommy, the veteran who once panicked at the smell of varnish, now stood front row, his hands relaxed at his sides. You ready? Claire asked him. He nodded. If I forget the words, I'll hum. That's the spirit, she said, grinning. By noon, the pier was alive. Families wandered between displays, dogs barked, fishermen swapped stories. Laughter mingled with the hiss of steam and the metallic cry of seagulls. Ben moved through it all like a man caught off guard by happiness, nodding to neighbors, accepting handshakes from men who'd once only scowled. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Claire, as if confirming she was still there, still real. Marla Pierce arrived mid-afternoon, dressed in black wool, eyes sharp as the winter light. She lingered near the edge of the crowd, watching. Claire noticed her immediately. Their gazes met across the dock. Ben's sister-in-law, one of the choir ladies, whispered, Yes, Claire said. Let her look. When Marla finally approached, her heels clicking on the boards, she surveyed the bustling yard with something close to disbelief. You did all this? She asked. We did, Claire said, nodding toward Ben. The town helped. Marla's mouth softened just slightly. He hasn't smiled like that in years. Claire followed her gaze. Ben was showing a teenager how to fit a rib plank, patient and precise. For a moment, the light caught his face, the same face Marla must have known before loss had carved it. He's remembering how, Claire said quietly. Marla studied her, expression unreadable. And you, what are you remembering? Claire hesitated, how to stay, before Marla could answer. The choir began their song, a local hymn adapted for the harbor. Voices rose, rough and honest, carrying over the water. Latham's name wasn't mentioned, but the defiance in the melody was unmistakable. Even Marla's eyes glistened. When they finished, the crowd clapped, stomping feet against the cold. Claire laughed, breath visible in the air. She turned to find Ben beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. You did this? He said. We did, she corrected. He shook his head. You brought them here. You made them remember why it matters. She accepted the cup, their fingers brushing. Neither moved away immediately. A burst of wind carried the smell of brine and varnish. The clouds had thickened, somewhere far off. Thunder muttered. Storm? She asked. Probably a squall, he said. Short one. But even as he spoke, a rope snapped loose from one of the mooring posts with a sharp, violent crack. The sound was unmistakable, a whip of tension breaking. A small rowboat at the edge of the pier lurched, slamming against the dock. The sound, that hollow bang of wood against wood, hit Claire like a blow. Her coffee fell from her hand, shattering on the planks. The world narrowed to the echo of that single noise, memory flooding in wind, water, a light flashing desperately offshore. Her voice barely made it past her lips. September 14th, she whispered. Ben turned to her sharply. What? Her face had gone pale. The night of the storm. The light that wouldn't stop flashing. I called 911. I thought it was a boat in distress. He stared at her, color draining from his face. What time? Just after 9, she said, voice trembling. They said the Coast Guard was already responding. I never knew. He went sheet white. That was her. He said, You're the one who called it in. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The harbor noise dulled around them, laughter fading, the crowd's voices distant and blurred. Claire's hands shook. I didn't know. Ben, I swear, I didn't. He stepped back as though steadying himself. No, you couldn't have. You tried to help. The words sounded right, but his tone was hollow. She reached out, but stopped. The crowd, oblivious, began singing again, a reprise of the hymn. The dock lights flickered as the first drops of rain began to fall. Ben looked out toward the lighthouse, its beams sweeping the gray horizon, and for a moment, his face was unreadable grief. Shock. Something deeper still. Ben, she whispered. He turned toward her, eyes distant. All this time. I thought that night belonged only to loss. His voice caught. Turns out it belonged to you, too. The wind rose, carrying the scent of the coming squall. Claire's breath hitched. What does that mean? I don't know, he said softly. Not yet. A gust scattered papers from the donation table, lifting them into the air like white birds. People laughed, chased them, unaware of the fracture that had just opened between the two people who'd held the harbor together. Ben turned back toward the lighthouse, rain streaking across his face, and for the first time since she'd known him, Claire couldn't read whether he was breaking apart or finally coming back to life. The morning after the squall, the harbor was hushed and glassy. The sky carried that pale, rinsed-out light that follows every storm, fragile, forgiving, and almost too bright. Claire sat in her car outside the Coast Guard station, engine off, fingers gripping the steering wheel as if she were holding her own breath. She had barely slept. The sound of that rowboat slamming the pier still echoed in her head, tangled with the memory she'd carried for years the night she called for help. A flare of light offshore, a voice on the radio, then silence. Now she needed to know. The officer at the desk was young, polite, confused at first by her request. You're asking for a call record from what year? 2013, Claire said, mid-September, around 9 at night. A distress light reported near Grey Gull Point. He checked his screen. That's old, he said. Give me a minute. While she waited, she watched the tide slide in and out beyond the window. Everything in her felt suspended, like the moment before a wave breaks. The officer returned with a printout. We digitized the old logs last year. There it is. He handed her the paper. Anonymous female caller, identified later as Claire Hadley, reporting a light offshore consistent with a capsized vessel. Coast Guard dispatched, recovered one deceased, one missing, follow-up classified as fatal maritime accident. Her throat tightened. Who? He looked again at the note. Name of the victim, Margaret Pierce Kincaid. Claire closed her eyes. Ben's wife. The officer hesitated. You said you were the caller. Yes, she whispered. I was. She drove home in silence, the printout trembling in her lap. When she reached the house, Ben's truck was already there. He stood by the porch railing, staring out at the water like a man who couldn't decide whether to curse it or thank it. He turned when she approached. His face was pale, drawn but not angry, just tired and somehow lighter. I went to the station, she said. I know, he replied. They called me. You know? He nodded slowly. They verified it. You made the call. The air between them tightened, like fabric stretched too thin. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. I didn't know, she said finally. That night, I saw the light from my window, I thought it was a signal someone lost. I called it in, but the operator said help was already on the way. I waited until I saw the beacon fade. She drew a shaky breath. I never knew who it was. Ben looked down at his hands. All these years, I blame myself for not getting to her sooner. But the truth is, if you hadn't called, I might have never found her at all. Her chest ached. You don't have to. I do. He met her eyes, the color of sea glass under overcast sky. That call, your voice, it was the one sound I kept hearing when I pulled her from the water. I thought it was the wind, or God, or something breaking in me. But it was you. She blinked, startled. You remember it, not clearly, just fragments. The dispatch radio echoing, a woman's voice saying, "Hold on, they're coming." I held onto that voice like a rope. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth. Ben, he stepped closer. You were the voice that stayed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and salt. Claire felt her pulse hammering, too loud for such quiet surroundings. Then why does it feel like that voice took something from you too? He shook his head. It didn't take anything. It gave me a chance to say goodbye, even if I didn't understand it. Then, tears slipped down her cheek before she could stop them. I thought knowing would break you. It might, he said softly, but hiding would have broken us both. He reached for her slow, deliberate, no distance left between intention and act. His hand found hers, rough and trembling, fingers curling around her palm like a man relearning trust. For a second, she forgot how to breathe. The contact was nothing like the clumsy accidents before. This touch held weight years of grief and gratitude and the fragile astonishment of still being here. His voice came low. I swore I'd never touch anyone again, not after her. But maybe I was wrong about what touch means. Claire squeezed his hand gently. It doesn't erase the past. No, he said. It just lets the present count for something. They stood there like that, the tide moving in behind them, the metronome of waves steady and sure. At last she said, I kept her light alive without knowing it belonged to you, and I kept punishing myself without realizing you'd already forgiven me. He answered. The words hung in the air too big for the small space between them, too tender to stay. Then, slowly. He lifted his free hand and brushed a tear from her cheek. His thumb lingered there, trembling but steadying with each heartbeat. The gesture was almost reverent, not desire, not apology, something simpler. Recognition. For a long time, they said nothing. The only sound was the surf, the whisper of water sliding against the rocks below. Finally. Claire smiled through her tears. Your hands remembered kindness after all. He nodded, eyes wet but unashamed. I guess they just needed reminding. The gulls wheeled above them, the lighthouse beams sweeping across their faces in long, slow intervals, 5 seconds of light, 5 seconds of shadow, over and over, marking the rhythm of 2 lives that had once crossed in tragedy, now learning how to move in sync. When she pulled her hand away, it wasn't to retreat, it was to breathe. He let her, watching as she stepped to the edge of the porch and looked out over the gray expanse of sea. Behind her, the metronome on the kitchen counter ticked faintly through the open door, 60 beats per minute, a house remembering to breathe again. Snow came before dawn, falling steady and soundless, draping the harbor in white. The town slowed to a hush, no boats, no hammering, no voices but the ones softened by the weather. Even the gulls seemed to know better than to disturb the peace. At the Gray Gull Lighthouse, the glass gleamed, newly polished for inspection. The trust board had requested an informal observation, a final look before deciding the fate of the endowment. But the house itself seemed ready before anyone arrived, every lamp trimmed, every brass hinge catching the pale morning light. Claire stood at the kitchen window, watching the snow curl off the sea like smoke. Ben was already at the lighthouse, checking the lamp housing, steady and quiet as always. The metronome ticked on the counter, 60 beats per minute, and for once it didn't sound like order, it sounded like calm. When he returned, his coat carried a dusting of snow, his hair damp around the edges. He set his gloves near the stove and said, The lens is clean enough to blind God himself. She smiled faintly. Good. Maybe he'll finally see what we've been up to. He almost laughed. Almost. The board'll be here by noon. I thought maybe. He hesitated, rubbing his palms together. Maybe before they come, I could show you something. Claire nodded. Lead the way. They climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The air smelled faintly of salt and brass polish. At the end of the hall, the locked door waited the one she'd walked past a dozen times without asking. He took a key from his pocket, hesitated once, then turned it in the lock. The hinges creaked softly. Inside was not a shrine as she had half feared, but a small, sunlit workshop. Brass pieces gleamed on a workbench, coils of wire, tiny screws, lenses from old ship instruments. A half-polished compass lay open beside a rag. This is where I came after the accident, he said. I couldn't face the yard or the sea, so I fixed what I could. Clocks, barometers, sextants. I'd tell myself it was just work, but really, I was trying to make time behave. She touched the edge of the table. Did it help for a while? He smiled faintly. Then the tremors started, hands shaking whenever I got close to finishing something. The first thing I dropped was a compass she'd given me. It shattered, and I couldn't make myself sweep it up for days. He exhaled. I locked the door after that. She looked around. Everything in the room gleamed with effort, not mourning, but repair. And now she asked softly. He glanced at his hands. Now they shake less when you're near. That made her throat tighten. That's not me. Ben, that's you learning how to live again. Maybe. He picked up the compass lid, turning it over until the reflection of the snow outside slid across the brass. I used to think vows were about control promises to prevent pain, but maybe they were about choosing to stay even when you could leave. She stepped closer. That's the only kind worth keeping. He looked up at her, and the air between them felt fragile but warm. I need to say this out loud, he said quietly. Not for the board, not for appearances for us. She nodded once, heart pounding. He set the compass down and took a breath that trembled but didn't break. I made a promise once that I'd never touch again. It was meant to keep me from hurting anyone. But it turned into a wall. His eyes met hers. So here's the new one. He reached out, not quite touching her hand. I will touch you only with consent, reverence, and warmth. Or I won't and still stay. The words settled into the quiet like snowflakes on water, melting as they landed, leaving only stillness behind. Claire felt tears burn the edges of her eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance he left for her. Her hands came up, one to his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath, the other tracing the faint line of his jaw. You don't have to promise absence anymore, she whispered, just presence. He didn't speak, didn't move, just waited, a man surrendering not to grief this time, but to grace. When she kissed him, it wasn't a rush or a spark. It was slow, certain, chosen. A meeting of breaths more than mouths. The quiet acknowledgement of two people who had already done their hurting and now wanted, cautiously, to heal. His hand rose to her face, fingers trembling once before steadying, palm warm against her skin. The metronome downstairs ticked faintly through the floorboards, slower now, as if following the rhythm of their breathing. When they finally parted, neither stepped back. That, he said softly, felt like the right vow. She smiled through her tears. It did. Outside. A knock at the front door startled them. The muffled voices of the trust board arriving early, boots crunching on the porch. Ben glanced toward the hall, then back at her. Ready? He asked. For what? To let them see what community life looks like? She grinned. If they don't see it now, they never will. He chuckled under his breath, the kind of sound that had been missing from him for years. As they descended the stairs, she noticed how easily he reached for her coat to help her into it, how naturally her hand brushed his sleeve. The movements were unstudied, real, downstairs. The metronome still ticked, 60 beats per minute, just as always, only now it didn't sound like restraint. It sounded like a pulse rediscovered. When the board members stepped into the kitchen, the scent of coffee and brass polish filled the air. Ben greeted them with quiet confidence. Claire poured steaming cups, smiling easily. The snow outside glowed against the window panes, turning everything to light. One trustee whispered to another, "They look like they've been here forever," and in a way, they had. By the time the tide reached its noon peak, the Stonemere Town Hall was full to bursting. Snowmelt dripped from boots and coats, forming small puddles along the old wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of salt and wool and coffee, the scent of people who'd shown up for something that mattered. At the front, the truss board sat in their usual formation, neat rows of folders, pens, the muted hum of bureaucracy waiting to be convinced. At the far side, Gregory Latham had set up his projector, sleek and self-assured, with a stack of glossy binders at his elbow. The man smiled like someone who believed he'd already won. Claire and Ben sat side by side. Their hands didn't touch, but the warmth between them was visible, a steady, invisible current. Around them, neighbors filled the benches, the choir, the yard workers, veterans, children, even Mrs. Duffy clutching a thermos like a weapon of faith. Latham began. His slides were clean, professional, precise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "the question before us is stewardship, not sentiment. The Kincaid Trust was built to serve the community, not to preserve nostalgia. What we have here," he clicked, revealing an aerial photo of the lighthouse, "is an underutilized property with limited economic viability." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. He ignored it, continuing, "Mr. Kincaid's personal circumstances, his recent, shall we say, symbolic marriage have complicated his judgment. Emotional attachment has no place in business management." Claire glanced at Ben, but his expression didn't change. He'd expected this. He was letting the storm spend itself. Latham moved through more slides, projected profit margins, potential condominium renderings. The harbor's legacy should evolve. Progress, not preservation. When he finished, the board chair, a woman named Mrs. Acker, folded her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Latham. Now, we'll hear from the community." A hush settled. Claire's heart pounded. The first to stand was Tommy, the veteran with the quiet eyes. He walked to the microphone in his worn jacket, voice gravelly but steady. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, "but I can tell you what it's like when someone shuts off the sander so you can breathe through the panic. Ben did that. Didn't make a scene, didn't say a word, just did it. You keep a man like that around, he knows the cost of noise." Applause rippled through the room. Next came Eleanor Bright, the choir soprano with arthritis, her scarf wrapped in the lighthouse's stripes. "I couldn't lift my arm higher than my shoulder last spring," she said, but Claire said, "We'll find the note another way." She made me paint the sound instead of sing it. Then one day I reached for the brush, and my arm went all the way up. I hit the note that Sunday. She smiled, eyes glistening. "That's what these two do. They fix things you didn't know were broken." The applause came louder this time, not polite, but proud. A deckhand in oil-stained jeans stood next, hat in hand. Ben gave me a job when no one else would. I'd come out of rehab with nothing but bad choices behind me. He said, "Show up at 6 and don't lie. Been sober a year. I still show up at 6. Mrs. Duffy followed, waving her thermos like a gavel. "If this board gives that lighthouse to some man with a drone and a spreadsheet, I will personally haunt you until Judgment Day." The laughter that followed was the kind that broke tension clean in two. Latham shifted, eyes narrowing. His smirk faltered. Then the board chair looked toward the back. "Mrs. Pierce," she said, "you asked to speak." A ripple of curiosity went through the room. Marla Pierce rose, her red coat sharp against the muted crowd. Claire felt her stomach tighten. If anyone could unravel what they'd built, it was Marla, the woman who'd once called her a paper bride. Marla walked to the front, heels echoing softly. When she reached the microphone, she paused, scanning the room, her brother-in-law, the crowd, the woman beside him, Her voice, when it came, was low but clear. "I came here angry," she began, "not at them, at life, at loss, at how unfair it all was." She took a slow breath. "When I first heard about their marriage, I thought it was an insult. To my sister, to everything we'd lost. I wanted to see it fall apart so I could say I was right." The room held still. "But I was wrong." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "I've watched Ben come back to life not through romance, but through purpose. Through the small, ordinary kindness that happens when two people help a town breathe again. Claire didn't take my sister's place. She reminded him there was still a world outside the storm." Claire's eyes blurred. Ben looked down, jaw tight. Marla continued, "So, if this board is deciding what community means, you're looking at it, right there." She gestured toward them both. "It's not a trust fund keeping Stonemere alive. It's trust, period, for a heartbeat." No one moved. Then applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling until the rafters seemed to hum with it. Even Mrs. Acker smiled faintly. Latham tried to speak, with respect, emotional testimony, but the chair raised a hand. "Enough, Mr. Latham. We've heard your projections. Now we'll render ours." The board members leaned together, voices low. The entire room waited, holding a collective breath. Finally, Mrs. Acker turned back to the crowd. "The board finds that the Kincaid Trust fulfills its purpose through continued stewardship under Mr. Kincaid and Mrs. Hadley. The shipyard and lighthouse remain in community hands." The room erupted cheers, applause, a few tears. Someone began to sing the harbor hymn, off-key but joyful, the metronome of many hearts beating at once. Latham gathered his binders with stiff precision, muttering something about public sentiment. When he brushed past Ben offered his hand, calm, steady. "The sea doesn't bend easy to plans," he said quietly. "You should have known that." Outside, the tide had risen high against the seawall, the sound deep and steady, not threatening, but alive. Claire stepped out into the light snow, still drifting through the air. The cold stung her cheeks, but she didn't mind. Ben joined her a moment later. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "Better than all right." He looked toward the lighthouse, its lens gleaming faintly against the pale horizon. "It stays," he said softly. "It stays." She echoed. For a moment, they simply stood there, two figures on the steps, their breath rising into the winter air, the town alive again around them. No victory speeches, no grand finale, just the quiet triumph of having held the light until the dawn returned. By late April, the lilacs had bloomed along the fence line, pale violet and sweet, bending under the wind that rolled in from the sea. The harbor was busy again, gulls circling, laughter rising, boat hulls thudding softly against the docks. The air smelled of salt and varnish and new beginnings. Inside the house, above the yard, the metronome that once ruled every hour sat quietly in a drawer. Its silence felt deliberate, earned. Ben didn't need it anymore. The rhythm of his days had returned on its own, less measured, more human. Claire stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him from the porch. He was showing a group of teenagers how to plane a cedar plank. His sleeves rolled, a smear of sawdust streaking his forearm. "Listen to the sound," he told them. "When the wood sings, you've found the grain." The kids nodded, wide-eyed. One of them, a lanky boy named Eli, who'd spent most of last summer in trouble, grinned. "Feels like magic," he said. Ben smiled back. "It's just attention. That's the closest thing to magic I know." Claire leaned against the doorframe, warmed by the sight. She'd seen him teach veterans to build model boats for therapy, watched him sand a splintered hull until it gleamed. But it was this, the patient teaching, the quiet laughter that showed how far he'd come. Her art program had grown too. The church hall was now a bright, cluttered space filled with canvases and clay and stories. Seniors painted storms they'd survived. Teenagers wrote songs about home. She still called it controlled mess. And Ben still teased her for it, but he never missed an exhibit. Every spring, the town held a new harbor open house, born from the one that saved the trust. It had become a celebration rather than a plea. The shipyard, the choir, the art show, the smell of chowder wafting down Main Street. This year, Marla had volunteered to run the raffle table. She was still sharp-tongued, but softer around the edges, her laughter less brittle. When Claire thanked her, Marla only said, "Don't get used to it," and slipped another ticket book into someone's hand. In the early evening, when the crowd thinned and the lanterns began to glow, Ben found Claire near the docks, packing up leftover canvases. "You missed the kids' boat race," he said. "I heard them from here," she replied. "Sounded like chaos." It was beautiful chaos. They walked together along the breakwater, past the tide line where the first green shoots had begun to sprout between the rocks. The lighthouse ahead gleamed like bone against the sky, its lens catching the last gold of the setting sun. "Halfway there," Claire said. "You realize it's been a year this week, I do," he said. "Feels like both forever and yesterday." She smiled. "You're terrible at anniversaries." "Maybe, but I'm good at lighthouses." When they reached the base, he unlocked the narrow door and gestured her inside. The stairwell coiled upward, warm from the day's sun. They climbed in companionable silence, boots echoing softly on the iron steps. At the top, the catwalk opened to wind and light. The sea stretched infinite, calm and silver blue. The wind came from the southeast 12 miles an hour, steady enough to turn the small weather vane on the rail. Below them, the harbor lights blinked on, one by one, mirroring the stars beginning to bloom overhead. Claire rested her hands on the railing, eyes half closed against the wind. "You ever think," she said, "that some places heal us just by standing still?" He looked out across the horizon. "This one does. It's not the light that saves ships, you know? It's the fact it doesn't move." She turned toward him then, smiling softly. "That sounds like something you'd say right before pretending you're not poetic." "I'm practical," he said, though the corner of his mouth betrayed him. They stood like that for a while, the sea breathing below, the air cool and clean. Then Claire stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "I think I owe you something," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I can't imagine what." "A moment," she said simply, "to bless the day." And before he could answer, she leaned in and kissed him slow, certain, unhurried, not to prove love or promise forever, but to mark the quiet joy of being exactly where they were. He smiled into it, the taste of salt and sunlight between them. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breath mingling with the wind. "You lit the lamp," he murmured. "I'll keep it trimmed." Her eyes glistened. "That sounds like a vow." "It is," he said softly, "the kind that stays." The beacon above them rotated once, casting a bright arc across the darkening sea. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, then again, steady as breath. Down below, laughter drifted faintly from the docks, the echo of community life carrying across the water. Claire looked out, seeing not the ghosts of what was lost, but the living proof of what remained. Ben slipped an arm lightly around her shoulders, and for once, the gesture felt effortless. No tremor, no hesitation, just warmth, quiet and earned. The tide moved in, whispering at the rocks. The lighthouse turned, light sweeping over them again and again, painting them both in gold before fading gently to silver. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The rhythm was enough. 5 seconds of light, 5 seconds of shadow, and in between the steady pulse of two hearts that had learned, at last, how to keep time without counting. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, not in grand gestures or perfect words, but in the quiet act of staying. Ben and Claire's story reminds us that love isn't always about starting over. Sometimes, it's about learning to breathe again beside the memories that once broke us. The past doesn't vanish, it softens, reshapes, becomes part of the light that guides us forward. We spend so much of our lives trying to fix what's been taken, to rebuild what the tide washed away, but maybe the real courage lies in letting the sea have its share and still choosing to live, Hands that once trembled can learn warmth again. Hearts that once feared touch can rediscover gentleness. And forgiveness, the quiet kind. The kind we give ourselves can turn even grief into grace. Because in the end, it's not about forgetting the storm. It's about learning to keep the lamp lit through the night steady, human, and true. Thank you for being here with us. For listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. Every like, every share, every gentle comment is more than support. It's a small act of kindness that helps light travel a little farther. Because when stories like this reach one more person, someone out there might feel a little less alone, a little more seen. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Together, we can keep these quiet lights burning one story, one soul at a time,